So a lot of the insight in locomotion engineering, particularly for legged locomotion, has come from bioinspiration. We've talked a little bit about bioinspiration, the importance of not copying, but rather seeking the principles and trying to extract the principles and use the principles. But you might still be wondering, why on earth would we, with our wonderful machines and our wonderful computers, sensors and motors, why would we ever bother to think about what the animals are doing when it seems clear that machines are much, much better at movement? But when you start thinking about this, you begin to understand that machines are very good at the extremes of performance. So machines are very highly specialized, and they're very, very good at their specialized designs. So, for example, here's a picture of the Helios rocket. And that spacecraft travels at very, very, very fast speeds approaching the speed of light, which, according to Einstein, is the fastest possible speed to achieve in the universe. And there certainly aren't any animals that travel anywhere close, speeds anywhere close to fractions of the speed of light, which Helios can do. Or alternatively, we can build ships, we can build ocean-going liners that have hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of volume in their cargo bays. Here's a picture of the Oscar with a tiny human shown for scale. There certainly aren't any animals at all that have been built that can achieve that sort of volume of load capacity. But when you start thinking about the ways in which the animals can perform their general tasks, they vastly outperform anything that we know how to build. So let's just consider, for the sake of future discussion, we're going to need notions of efficiency before the course is over. Let's introduce the particular idea of specific resistance, the measure of specific resistance, which you're very familiar with if you drive a car. Specific resistance is, in some sense, miles per gallon, but the biologists like to invert this, and the biologists like to think about gallons per load mile. Here's what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're going to be looking at the ratio of the energy required to travel a certain distance while bearing a certain mass load. All right? And so here's a plot from a paper about 10 years old by my colleague Art Kuo, wonderful fellow who's straddled the line between mechanical engineering and biomechanics for quite some time. Very, very wonderful thinker and exciting work. And he's plotting for us in this figure, he's plotting against the ordinate the mass of the mechanism which is traveling. And on the abscissa, he's plotting in log coordinates. He's plotting the ratio of the energy consumed in order to achieve some distance to the distance traveled times mg, times the load that was being borne. Another way to think about this that we'll find equally convenient in our future work is to think about this energy distance ratio as being the integral of the power speed ratio. And we'll come back to this idea later, but I want to introduce it right now in the beginning of the course. The point I want to make in this viewing of the diagram is that you can see that so efficiency is a measure, is a unitless measure. Specific resistance measures how efficient travelers are, locomotives are, and you can see that as the mass goes up, we begin to build more and more and more specialized machines. The Boeing 787 over here, the freight trains down here. It's only the very most extreme animals that exist at those large masses that have comparable gallons per mile, if you want to think about it that way, a specific resistance. As soon as you begin to take animals and put them in more adversarial and more complicated environments, particularly the land animals, I think you can see that very, 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 very few robots, no machines and very few robots. We'll be talking about the Rex robots pretty soon, later in the course. But it's only really the animals that are achieving reasonable ratios, reasonable specific resistance ratios. And in general, the animals are unmatched on terrain, on hard substrates. And so we're finding it very, very useful to pay attention to what the animals know how to do in their ability to locomote on land in particular. So animals are generalists. They're at least as cheap in general, and they're much cheaper on general terrain, particularly on hard substrates, than any machines that we've been able to build, and it behooves us therefore to look at the animals as well. It turns out that the animals are at least as agile, and one can begin to argue that the animals are much more agile. Curiously, we don't still have very, very well-defined notions of agility. I don't think there'll be much time in this course to talk much about engineering metrics of agility, but the ability to leap and the ability to change direction quickly, intuitively, enters into this notion of agility. But if you think about the agility as having something to do with acceleration, we have these wonderful automobiles that we're building. Porsches, your wonderful Porsche is getting about 12 meters per second square acceleration, depending on which ad you read. But this is on very, very carefully prepared terrain, right? An asphalt paved road is where the Porsche is able to achieve these accelerations. Whereas, in contrast, fish, sailfish in particular, in this article, are able to achieve nearly the same accelerations at a variety of speeds in very, very complicated ocean environments where there are many, many currents and many obstacles. Nothing of the kind have we been able to build right now. And of course, the champion runner in the vertebrate world, the cheetah, can accelerate at least as fast as the Porsche can, and it can do it over vastly varied terrains, as you're getting the sense from this wonderful picture from Professor Alan Wilson in his relatively recent Nature article. There's nothing that we've been able to build that has this kind of agility. And so we're fascinated to understand what it is about the animals that allow them to achieve such general purpose locomotion capabilities. And we're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about the ways in which biologists understand animal motion and the ways in which we can extract principles and move those principles over to robots as the semester goes on. Another more generic reason for taking our inspiration from animals is that there's increasing evidence, if you track the insights of the evolutionary ecologists, there's increasing evidence that mobility is in itself the historical origin of all intelligence, animal intelligence particularly. So when you begin to read these evolutionary arguments about the shift from filter feeding toward the vertebrate animal design, it becomes clear that the need to actively disperse was achieved via segmentation of muscles and achieved as well by the beginnings of a nervous system, centralized nervous system, particularly the beginnings of a spinal cord that is called a notochord in some of these primitive animals. And here's a very important article that was written 40 years ago as the evolutionary ecologists began to understand the importance of the origin of the vertebrates, the head, as having been a consequence of the modification of filter feeding into mobility. And particularly as you begin to get mobility, this permits selective predation, okay? And so you get active seeking of prey using distal external sensing, that is, sensors that look out from the world, that are not just trained on the body, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you begin to get a centralized nervous system, not just a notochord, but the beginning of a neural crest at the top, which is the forerunner of the brain. And so here's a picture from a 2000 article by Zimmer that gives you some sense of what the first vertebrates might have looked like. They looked like these jawless fishes, but most important, they had notochords and they had beginnings of brains. And so the brain itself seems to be fundamentally motivated by the need to disperse and to direct locomotion to either seek for your prey or to escape from your predators. This observation has been carried forward by numbers of evolutionary ecologists over the last 10, 20 years, and it becomes clear that the mobile seeking brains are the foundations of the mammalian hippocampus. The mammalian hippocampus is the cause of the 2014 Nobel Prize that was won by the Mosers in medicine and physiology. And what the Mosers were able to do is they were able to show that the mammalian hippocampus is actually the seat of spatial navigation. They were able to show that there are specialized cells that fire when rats encounter very particular landmarks, and a different set of specialized cells that fire as rats progress in body length distance along their environments, even when they're not looking at landmarks. It's well known to the psychologists, it has been well known to the psychologists for a long time, that the hippocampus is the seat of episodic memory, and it was the Mosers and the similar neurophysiologists over the last 20 years who have been able to show that these episodic memory sites are exactly lined up with the anatomy of the brain that holds our ability to perform spatial navigation tasks. And they have pinned down the physiological basis in these wonderful neurons in this particular part of the brain anatomy that that seems to be that not seems, but has been provably shown to embody the animal's capability at spatial navigation. So it's spatial navigation, of course, that's the basis for our general cognitive abilities. There's growing agreement that animals do have cognitive maps, that the cognitive maps are physiologically housed in the hippocampus for mammals, the notion of a cognitive map has been much more carefully advanced in the last 20 years than ever before. It seems clear that competitive navigation, which arose 500 million years ago in the Cambrian period, as we were talking on the previous slide, is built from chemotaxis. This is a hypothesis that's been pursued by Professor Jacobs, Lucia Jacobs at Berkeley, one of my collaborators, wonderful collaborator. She has a theory of the origin of this spatial navigation capability, which is at the foundation of animal foraging, which is at the foundation of animals' ability to survive. And she has a notion of how to unpack the spatial navigation capabilities in terms of what we would call both gradient-based and topological navigation. We won't have time to talk about these higher level navigational capacities that use locomotion, but it's important to understand that the animals only began to develop their episodic memories and their ability to have cognitive maps at all, cognitive maps being the basis of cognition, in consequence of the mobility that they began to develop in order to become diverse olfactory trackers, meaning, for example, honeybees seek out flowers, or deep water sharks seek out prey, or homing pigeons seek out their lodging. In all these cases, it turns out that the hippocampus and the analogs of the hippocampus in non-mammalian species are much larger, and their olfactory capabilities are much more pronounced in animal species that have historically developed this seeking mobility, whether they're predators or prey. And so we'll find ourselves spending a lot of time pursuing animal designs and animal body designs, mobility, not just because the animals are so far superior to the machines in their agility and their general locomotion capabilities, but because it seems clear that intelligence itself, as we understand it in generalized autonomous fashion, arose in consequence of mobility. And we think it makes much more sense to look to the animals for intelligence than, say, to look for naive symbolic intelligence. Machines have been playing chess better than human beings for the last 30 years now, and machines now play Go better than any human being on the planet, but machines still can't walk up the stairs as well as my children could when they were 1.5 and 2 years old. And so we find ourselves drawn to the animals because animal intelligence is so far superior to anything that we've been able to build artificially, and that's going to remain true for quite some time. And we find that the embodied intelligence seated in the animal body designs is intimately tied up not just with their locomotion capability, but with their very cognitive intelligence itself. And that's what we'll be spending a lot of time thinking about as the semester goes on.